said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news. "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her.
Let's read the story together with me again. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple, who reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look onto the tomb, and she saw two angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and to your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. That is a long story, and I have a question for you at first. If you were a news reporter assigned to check out this story after the event, what would be the first thing you would do? Would you inspect the linen wrappings in the tomb? Would you maybe interview Mary, since she was the one who saw Jesus? Or would you maybe interview Peter to learn more of what the tomb was like? Would you maybe look around for other people, even outside the tomb area, who may have seen Jesus after he rose? Or was there maybe something else that came to your mind?
Um, Hi, I'm Jenny. I think I would go to the tomb and see what there was to see, is the first thing I would do. Wes?
Well, I think that probably about the same thing, because people are just curious.
Mhm.
Those are good points, I think. Is my microphone still muted? Oh, I'm here. Okay, cool. Thank you, Miss Ginny, and hi, Miss Wet. I'm glad to hear from you. Those are good points. Yeah. I think if I were there, I probably would have done the same thing. I probably would have looked around. I might have even maybe I would have even touched the linen wrappings and just to feel them and just to see.
Hey, darling, I'm in the middle of a Bible study. Call you back.
I'm also monitoring our YouTube live stream. I think it's up now. So just if anyone types something in.
There's Mr. Cruz. He's hiding.
Well, all right. It looked like if no one wants to say anything no more, I'm just going to continue. Like in the other Gospels, Mary Magdalene really discovers that the tomb is empty first. Only, unlike the other Gospels, Mary Magdalene seems to be all by herself. There's no one around her at all. But really, her part in general in this Gospel is kept to a bare minimum in a way. We don't really know how she even feels or all of what she does and what was going on with her. Was it maybe fear that grabbed her, that led her to run away from that empty tomb? Or was it maybe joy or excitement? Was she just maybe even confused about what was going on? Or just wondering and astounded and shocked? We really don't know a whole bunch about her. And then there's Peter, who really kind of does the Peter thing to do, if you think about it. I always think of Peter as, he always comes across, or he is really the most intense of all disciples. When I think of Peter, I really think of Jesus and the foot washing, where unlike all the other disciples who just let Jesus wash their feet, he just kind of refuses at first at all and says that he should be washing Jesus's feet instead. And once Jesus explains to him that it's kind of necessary, he wants his head washed also. He just kind of goes all in, all about. And Jesus again has to explain to him that the feet are enough. And another story that I always connect with Peter is really the one where he's chopping the guard's ear off in the Garden of Gethsemane to defend Jesus. Once again, it's Jesus who has to explain to Peter that it's all right, it's all good. Things have to happen this way, basically. And of course, even though he's not the first one maybe to get there, even though he's outrun by the beloved disciple, by that other disciple, he is the one who runs straight into the tomb. He probably would have not even ever seen a point in waiting outside the tomb at all. But Peter doesn't really play the biggest role here, unlike he does in so many other disciple stories. It's really the beloved disciple himself who kind of is. He really stays outside the tomb first, just looking in, and he really doesn't enter the tomb until Peter himself goes in. So the second question for you all is, why do you think the other disciple did not go in, even though he outran Peter, to reach the tomb first? Was he maybe afraid of the tomb robbers? Or did he maybe feel uneasy about maybe seeing a dead person? Maybe was he afraid to maybe even hope? Or was he even looking for Jesus outside? Or was maybe something else that came to your mind?
Sorry. Well, I think John was afraid to go in there. I wouldn't want to run into a tomb where people had been dead for like days. I was kind of be a little nervous about that. But Peter's a very impetuous person. He just ran. I pass.
Infatuous is a good word for it, I'm sure. Yeah. Um, yeah, I was always, it's always striking to me. Like he sees the linen wrappings there, but he still doesn't want to go in. I don't know what he made out of that, but
The silent movie. I'm so good.
It could have been with out of respect too for the dead.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's it.
maybe he was thinking, okay, there's the wrapping, but maybe Jesus is still there, and it was just out of respect to, or maybe he put Peter before himself and thought Peter should go first.
I think that's a good point. Yeah. It could have a lot to do with the respect. Yeah.
That's Vicky.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
and what it really made me think, what your comment, thank you for that, really made me think of too was, I think in ancient Israelite culture, um, if you were to encounter a dead person in general and would encounter the dead, you were ritually speaking unpure as well. So I don't know if the beloved disciple was necessarily ritually pure and cleaned up. After all, he was Jesus' disciple. He wasn't necessarily a priest, but that might have played a part in it too. Thank you, guys. Now I'm going to follow it up. I'm just wondering, now that we've talked about basically what Mary did and what Peter did and what the beloved disciple even did, imagine you were there that morning. What would you have done at the empty tomb if you were one of the disciples right away? Would you maybe have looked if the body was hidden somewhere else in the tomb, or would you have wandered and pondered what might have happened? Would you have maybe even fallen to your knees and worship in faith, really? Or would it have been something else?
I probably would have run into the tomb to look for myself in case something was missed. And then, with the realization what had happened, probably fall on my knees.
Yes.
Well, I think I would have looked around. I think I would have looked around inside the tomb and then started looking around the whole area. I don't know. How about you, Wes?
I would have just been astounded, and I just don't know what I would have done, because we just, when we kind of, it's something strange, we just kind of ignore it sometimes.
True. Those are good points. Yeah. I feel like they all have something, something about themselves. I wouldn't even know what to do anymore. I wouldn't even know what I would have done anymore. Because it's really big news, isn't it? To think about that, but at the same time, it's also, it's such a surprise and such a shock in a way. I would have probably been, in a way, dumbfounded. But at the same time, it's so intriguing to explore that tomb more and further in a way as well, to see what was going on in there. Well, there's certainly not just one answer to what is the right thing to do when you get to the tomb, to the open up tomb for Jesus. Um, and there's also probably certainly not the one right answer as to why the beloved disciple just kind of doesn't go into the tomb. We don't really know. But what we do know about him is that he comes to believe right there once he sees it. And the gospel immediately continues in verse 9, really, with the words, "For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead." And that's really an interesting sentence to follow up with the disciple believed. So it kind of poses like a conflict, doesn't it? In the way, on the one hand, he believes, which, well, in order to believe, you have to believe something, you have to understand something. But on the other hand, they didn't really get the right thing. So maybe what the disciple believes is really that Jesus has, in a way, conquered death, but he's not able to put all the pieces together yet to what Jesus is doing. Yeah, he's not able to see that maybe that this was a necessary part of Jesus's mystery, Jesus's ministry. I think what all of that really boils down to, and what all of that really means, is that faith from the empty tomb is still partial. It is still not all the way complete yet. There is still something missing, and that is the resurrected and the ascended Jesus. I like the point that you have made concerning the last question about exploring the tomb further and really looking around in it. Because I feel like, in a way, that's where the text kind of leads us to as well. In the first 10 verses here, it's almost like there's like a show curtain that is opening up further and further and taking us closer and closer towards the tomb in a way. As the verses progress, we really find out more and more about what was going on in the tomb, or with the tomb in general. At first, we have Mary Magdalene, who sees the stone that is rolled away and doesn't know what to do with it. Then we have the beloved disciple, who notices the linen wrappings. And then we see Peter, who notices even the headcloth also, which is neatly wrapped up in a place on its own. And I think there's really also a reason why we learn about the cloth and the wrappings in the first place. And that takes us back to our first session, basically, where we talked about Lazarus and Jesus being the resurrection and the life. Lazarus came out of the tomb still wearing all his burial cloths. And the word for head wrapping there and is the same, really, as it is here in this text. And I think that is definitely not a coincidence. So what John is trying to tell us is that no one has really taken Jesus away. It's really rather the other way around. Jesus has left death behind altogether himself, really. So, despite all the evidence, though, faith from the tomb is still just partial. It is still incomplete. And I think that the story of the tomb, ultimately, it invites us to linger a little bit. The empty tomb story has to say something in its own right. Well, poor little Mary Magdalene, though, in a way, she's all by herself in this Gospel of John, even though she's able to reach the disciples, to spread the good news and proclaim to them what she has seen. She still seems to remain alone in her grief. The disciples seem to only be focused on the tomb. They are, and then they kind of seem to leave the scene, really unnoticed. And there's not another human being there that is really, who's there for her, who's able to console her. But she's in for a huge surprise. All of a sudden, Jesus is appearing by her or behind her. And still she doesn't recognize him at first. Instead, she kind of thinks that he's the gardener at first. After he says to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? What are you looking for, or whom are you looking for?" Her answer is kind of ironic. "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him." And in a way, and it's ironic because, well, Jesus kind of has carried the body away, right? He hasn't carried himself away. I mean, Jesus is the one who has the power to pick up his own life again. But that is true on like a whole other level than Mary is kind of trying to say that. Mary is just thinking about depositing a corpse. Yeah, Jesus has kind of picked up his own life. That's on that's kind of on a different level. Mary really doesn't recognize who Jesus was at first. My next question for us is, why do you think Mary Magdalene was so slow to recognize who Jesus was? Was it maybe because Jesus looked differently after he rose from the dead? Or was Mary just in shock? Was Mary maybe so sure that he was dead that she wasn't even expecting to see him, and that her knowledge or her expectation that he was dead kind of blinded her? Or was it maybe something else altogether?
I think it's a combination of all of them, that she was in shock. She knew that he had died. And she certainly didn't expect to see him. She could have thought that someone stole the body. So everything, she was totally in shock. She just didn't expect to see him.
Well, I reckon he looked a little better than the last time she saw him, too. You know, he was tortured to death, and in a very gruesome manner. He was spat on, had a crown of thorns on him, was dripping blood, no doubt sweaty. He had been bled out to a certain extent, you know, by being pierced. So I imagine he was looking a tad bit better, don't you think?
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. And, it's also important to notice that, that makes a lot of sense. And it's also important to notice, you're right, Mary Magdalene was even there when Jesus was on the cross, unlike most other, pretty much most of the other disciples. And that's for sure, he did look a lot better than the last time she saw him. I also have a comment here on YouTube. Miss Vicky, I think that's a good point as well. She just says, yeah, Mary was in shock. Yeah, how couldn't you be when you see a person that you believe was dead, being raised to life again? Thank you all for your comments and responses. Ultimately, all really Jesus has to do is call Mary by name, though. And once he calls her Mary, she recognizes who he is.
Amen.
It is really Jesus's presence and Jesus calling her by name, Mary, that really turns everything around, that turns her sorrow and her tears of sadness into perhaps tears of joy, but definitely joy and excitement all along. That's a really important point and a really neat point. But what I also love about Mary in this story is that she is there all along. She sees the empty tomb and she sees Jesus, and there's a whole lot that she doesn't understand necessarily at first. She sees the empty tomb and she runs back to the disciples. She doesn't say necessarily, our Lord has risen. She simply says, hey, the stone is rolled away. She sees or she hears and sees Jesus, but she doesn't recognize Jesus until he really calls her by name. She doesn't recognize him right off the bat. And yet, Jesus he finds it, he sticks around. He's patient with her in a way, and he finds a way to open her eyes to who he is. I found a lot of comfort in that when I was studying this text, because to me it says that we don't always have to get it right the first time. We don't always have to see Jesus or Christ when he's present with us the very first time. That's not how it works. Sometimes Jesus is gracious and patient enough to stick around with us and maybe to point our heads into a different direction, in order to make his presence known in our lives. It's not like a one and done. It's like, well, I was there, but you didn't recognize me, so I'm gone. So I thought that was kind of a powerful point in there. It's also interesting to see that once Mary really recognizes Jesus, she calls Jesus with the term Rabboni, which doesn't just mean teacher, but it means my teacher. It's a very endearing term. She's the first one to call Jesus just that, Rabboni, in the Gospel of John. But there are two other people earlier in the Gospel who call Jesus Rabbi, and those are really Jesus's first disciples. There are two, Simon Peter being one. I think the other one is not mentioned, but we find the whole story in chapter 1. And that's really not even the only similarity we have between chapter 20, where Jesus is resurrected, and between the beginning of the gospel. The first words that Jesus says in the Gospel of John are, "What are you looking for?" to just those two disciples, to Simon Peter and the other one. And again here, after he rose from the dead, he says to Mary Magdalene, "Why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" So there's another connection right there. And if you want to, you can even find more parallels to the gospel, in this gospel, to the beginning or to other key parts. Just like Jesus said, for example, in chapter 8, that he is the light of the world. So he now, his presence and with his words really enlightens Mary Magdalene, who came to the tomb while it was still dark. And I think there's a pretty practical reason for that as well. We are in chapter 20 now, so John is kind of getting ready to wrap up his gospel. And, John does it in the style of any great storyteller. He connects the beginning and the end, or in the end, he kind of connects also key themes to the story in a really great way. So just to make clear that all the important pieces that he has said in his story come kind of true, or kind of come together here in the end. Jesus is indeed the resurrection and the life, like he said to Lazarus. He's indeed the light of the world, like he said in chapter 8. And it's kind of it's a great work that he does here. Actually, that is already all I have for you today. Does anyone have any final questions or comments or anything that they want to talk about?
Wes has already read all lessons, so she says she's going to get A's.
No.
That's funny. Miss Vicky also mentioned Mary was really having her faith tested here. I think that's a very good point as well. It certainly was a test of faith too, wasn't it? Like it always kind of is, perhaps, when Jesus is visiting you.
No, that's I don't know who that gentleman is. I don't think he's from our church. Doesn't have his name on it.
Well, you all, thank you for joining me again tonight for our Bible study for the third session, and for listening to the good news. But this is only the beginning, really, of the good news. Jesus is still about to meet his disciples, and he is about to meet Thomas, and he is about to ascend. And that is what we're going to be talking about next week, when we're going to be reading further along in the 20th chapter of John, verses 19 through 31. and where we're talking about that the Lord is being with us. Yeah, thank you for joining me for tonight. Stay healthy and blessed and be safe out there. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. This is all strange to me. I have no idea of how the technology of any of this is done, but I enjoyed it thoroughly.
It's magic.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for joining us, everyone.
There's Mr. Cruz. I hear him.
When death was arrested, my life began.
No, that's not Mr. Cruz. That's somebody else.
Well, ash was redeemed, only beauty remains. And my orphan heart was given a name. My morning grew quiet, my feet rose to dance. When death was arrested, my life began. Oh, your grace, so free, washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you. Released from my chains, I'm a prisoner no more. My shame was a ransom he faithfully bore. And he canceled my debt, and he called me his friend. Oh, when death was arrested and my life began. Oh, your grace so free washes over me. You have made me new, now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new, now life begins with you. Oh, only you.
Oh, it's all. Well, that was pretty exciting. Now you
Our Savior displayed on a criminal's cross, and darkness rejoiced as though heaven had lost. But then Jesus arose with our freedom in hand. That's when death was arrested and my life began. That's when death was arrested and my life began. Oh, your grace so free join the song before the routine. Yes, we're free, free, forever, amen. When death was arrested, my life began. When death was arrested, my life began. When death was arrested, my life began.